Why should I believe Christianity? Well, in order to answer that question, we got to know what Christianity is. And so, over the next few lectures, we're going to dive in a little more deeply and get a broad sort of view with some specifics about what Christianity is. Now, Christianity is, at the very least, it's an entire worldview or story of everything. Now, we can't properly evaluate Christianity then by only looking at its individual parts in isolation from each other, right? That would be, in some sense, unfair, a misrepresentation. It would be a biased look at Christianity or any worldview. When considering any worldview, we need to sort of consider it in its totality. Let me give you some analogies for why this why it would be a problem to look at the individual parts in isolation from one another. Do you think it would be a mistake on my part to base your grade for this class solely on one assignment? Or should I take into consideration your work during the entire class? How about your sports ability? Should I base my evaluation of your ability as an athlete based solely on your one strikeout, or missed pass, or failed dig, or slam, or whatever? Would that be fair? Of course not. The same is true of Christianity. We cannot fairly evaluate its claim to the truth by looking at just one or two of its major claims and then attempting to determine whether they're accurate in isolation from the rest of the claims of Christianity. Suppose, like the famous philosopher David Hume, that we attempted to figure out if miracles are possible. Should we just get to work on attempting to figure that out in isolation from God's existence? In other words, should we try to determine the possibility of miracles independent of God's existence? Or should we first try to figure out whether God exists and then look into the possibility of miracles? Seems obvious, right? So not only does Christianity need to be considered as a whole, there is a logical order to at least some of its major claims. For example, if God exists, then miracles seem to be clearly possible. Whereas if God doesn't exist, then miracles seem to be much less likely, indeed, impossible. So the claims of Christianity it's possible that they make great sense when viewed and evaluated together. The claim of this book and of our class is that that is indeed the case, that the claims of Christianity support and reinforce each other in all sorts of ways. Now, I said that Christianity is a worldview, but what is a worldview? Well, let me give you a basic definition. This is the definition that corresponds, I think, to your reading. A worldview is a comprehensive view of the world. It's a philosophical view of the world, the entire universe, all of reality. Okay, so I'm going to give you a different, but I think compatible way to think about worldviews, and this is going to be a little more involved, so bear with me. First, think of the entire world, and by entire world, I mean the sum total of everything that exists or is real. So whatever's real, whatever exists, is in the sum total of everything. It's part of the world. For example, trees, planets, atoms, stars, gravity, light, space, humans, dogs, cats, birds, baseball, soccer, chess, love, life, minds, God, angels, demons, brains, anger, gremlins, lizard people, unicorns. Okay? So think about all those things in that list. Maybe some of them don't exist. If they don't, then they're not part of the world. Right? They're not part of the sum total of everything. Now, it seems pretty obvious that there is a sum total of all that exists. That's the world. That's the world. Second, think about how there are different sets of beliefs about what is real, about what exists. So here's the idea. We've got the sum total of everything that exists, and then we've got beliefs about what exists. Okay? Those may be different, right? Let's consider one set of beliefs that includes the claim that God exists. And consider another set of beliefs that includes the claim that God does not exist. Right? A worldview is going to be a complete set, a set of beliefs or claims about everything. Your beliefs belong to one of those sets, one of those worldviews. So you have a worldview even if you do not know much of it, even if you don't care. If you believe that trees exist, then your worldview is different from those that claim that trees do not exist. Maybe they claim that trees are just illusions or projections of our minds or whatever. But if your worldview includes the claim that trees exist, then your worldview is going to be different from worldviews that do not include that claim. Now, we care about worldviews, not really insofar as they include claims about trees and whatnot. No, the real reason we care about worldviews is because they include really important claims. Claims about what matters and what does not. What is good, what is bad, what is beautiful. The meaning of life and death. Whether or not God exists. Third thing. Notice that if worldview, let's call it worldview 1 and worldview 2, if those are different worldviews, then they have to disagree about something. And the disagreement really needs to be fundamental or an essential disagreement. So, let's say one of the worldviews claims that God exists and the other denies that God exists. So, those worldviews, right, are different worldviews, right? They disagree about a fundamental matter. Consider another worldview that claims that morality is objective, and another worldview, a different worldview, that denies that morality is objective, right? So if God exists, then any worldview that denies God's existence is going to be false, at least on that major important issue. So it is not possible, this is the key takeaway here, it's not possible for two different worldviews to both be true, since they have to disagree over something in order to count as different. So that's a different way of thinking about worldviews. I hope that that's a little more expansive, a little more explanatory for what worldviews are. You can also think about worldviews as lenses through which we view everything, including and importantly ourselves. Your beliefs and assumptions about what kind of thing you are, about whether God exists, about whether some things are truly bad or unjust, and so on, they shape how you live, how you interact with others, and how you make sense of things, how you make sense of your experience. Have you ever noticed how people react so differently to the exact same event? Let me give you an example. Suppose Frank and Sally's mom dies. Frank reacts by abandoning Christianity, while Sally reacts by becoming even more devoted to Christ. What is going on here? Frank and Sally experience their mom's death differently, in part because they view the world, God, morality, the purpose of life, and so on, differently. Their mom's death brought to the surface some significant differences between Frank and Sally's worldview. Okay, now, how should we go about determining which worldview is the true one, which worldview we should adopt? Our book gives us 4 ways to test worldviews to determine which one is true or truer than others. Let me briefly go over these, And my explanation, again, will be different from what you find in your reading. The consistency test. This is our first test of a worldview. If some set of beliefs or claims are inconsistent, then they cannot all be true. That's just what it means for a set of beliefs to be inconsistent. So if a worldview has inconsistent claims, then that worldview cannot be true, at least with respect to those claims. Now, we've got to be very careful here. A lot of people think all sorts of things about Christianity or Islam or Hinduism that are just not true of those religions. So we need to be careful not to confuse what some people think a worldview says and what the worldview actually says or implies. What we want to know is what the actual worldview says and not merely what some people say that it says. If the actual worldview involves inconsistent claims, then it's false. Now, just by way of sort of getting our minds working, what are some false beliefs that people have about Christianity? In other words, what do some people think Christianity teaches, but it really doesn't? Let me give you just a few examples. Think about heaven and hell. Lots of people think that heaven and hell are disembodied states. That is, they're states where just our souls go, right? And that's it. That's all there is to them. Christianity doesn't really teach that, right? We'll talk about this in more depth later. Lots of people think that Christian love means accepting all of the behaviors of everyone. Lots of people think that the claim, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," means that we cannot condemn any behaviors at all. Many people think that God created the universe because he was lonely. Now, none of those claims are part of Christianity. So we've got to make sure that we are evaluating the actual worldview. Whether it's the Muslim worldview, the Hindu worldview, the Buddhist worldview, our goal is to examine the actual worldview and not a misrepresentation of it. That's the consistency test. Second test, the coherence test. Now, coherence is a stronger notion than consistency. If some set of beliefs or claims cohere, then they are consistent. But it is not true that if some set of beliefs or claims are consistent, then they cohere. In other words, coherence implies consistency, but consistency does not imply coherence. Let me give you some examples. So the following is a consistent set of claims. Grass is green, 2 + 2 = 4. I exist. Those can be and are all true, but they lack a kind of coherence because they're unrelated to each other. So coherence involves consistency plus support. A set of claims is coherent if it is both consistent and the statements support or are connected to each other in certain ways. So when we examine Christianity, we're going to want to ask, is it coherent? Do the claims, are they consistent, and do they support one another in interesting ways? Third test, the explanation test. We can test a worldview for its explanatory power. Does it leave things out that need to be accounted for? Does it require that we reject some things that are clearly true or real? Let me give you just some quick explanations of simple things. What explains a shadow? Well, minimally, you got to have light, you got to have something blocking light, and you got to have a surface. You got to have those three things in order to account for the existence of shadows. And now notice, once you have those things, once you've got light, blockage of light, and a surface, it's unsurprising that there are shadows. Now, that's called a natural or a physical explanation. What explains my being tired right now? Well, minimally, the amount of time I slept, plus the amount of time humans need for brain and bodily proper function. Those two things together make it unsurprising that I'm tired. Now, let me give you some more philosophical examples. What explains the wrongness of rape? or the wrongness of murder or torture or racism? What explains why those things are wrong? Could it be culture? No. Why won't that work? Let me just give you a quick little hint. If we try to explain the wrongness of rape, murder, torture, or racism by appeals to a culture, we're going to fail. Why is that going to fail? Well, because some cultures don't think that each and every one of those items is wrong. So we can't explain the wrongness of rape by appealing to culture because that explanation will fail. Maybe personal preference explains the wrongness of rape, murder, torture, and racism. That won't work either. Why not? So when we're considering Christianity as a worldview, we want to ask this question. Does it explain the stuff that needs explaining, and does it do so well? Last test, the evidence test. A true worldview is going to fit the evidence. Now, we've got evidence of our senses, we have evidence from reason, evidence from science, from morality, from introspection, from our emotions, from history, blah, 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 blah. Evidence is anything that can serve as a truth indicator. Evidence can help confirm or disconfirm a worldview. But, this is the tricky part, evidence is interpreted in light of a worldview. Even though that's the case, that is, what we take to be evidence is often a function of the worldview we're operating from, it's still true that some evidence does fit better with some worldviews and not as well with others. So we want to ask these sorts of claims. What is the worldview that we're considering? What does it predict? That is, if the worldview is true, then what would be really surprising? Or if the worldview is true, what would be unsurprising? Now, these types of tests, these 4 tests, these are common to philosophy, science, day-to-day life. You use them all the time. I've just given names to them. Now, let me talk real quick about irrelevant tests, tests that we're not going to appeal to when evaluating any worldview. I'm going to give these tests a name as well, the comforting test. In other words, I'm not going to evaluate the truth or falsity of a worldview based on whether I'm comfortable, based on whether it makes me comfortable or my life more comfortable. Another irrelevant test, the pleasure test. I'm not going to evaluate the truth or falsity of a worldview based on whether it brings me a great deal of pleasure. The wealth test. I'm not going to evaluate the truth or falsity of a worldview based on whether it brings about a great deal of wealth in my life. Now, those tests are not totally unimportant, but they're not as connected to the truth as our 4 other tests are. Now, as we go through, right, we should attempt at various places, and we're going to do this, to compare worldviews. We're not going to do it in depth in this class. That's not what this class is all about. But there are other classes that you can take here who do that. Now, why should we compare worldviews? Here's a big reason. A problem for one worldview could turn out to be a problem for all of them. And it could be the case that while X is a problem for each and every worldview, one worldview handles X better than all the others. So we've got to compare worldviews, and we've got to be careful not to ditch a worldview, immediately when we encounter a problem with it. We should see if other worldviews handle that problem better. Okay, so as we're going through this, we need to keep in mind Christianity is a worldview. We need to take into consideration the whole thing as we're evaluating it. And as we move forward in our class now, we are going to look at some of the big elements of the worldview of Christianity.